1887. Waverly, Iowa experienced a striking scandal that spread across the nation. This is a story almost completely lost in history, involving the mysterious death of a young lawyer and the conviction of his colleague. Sensual relationships developed while others began to sour. Was a jealous husband looking for revenge? Or was a successful career in jeopardy? You can be the judge of that.
Think of a world in which most light is from lanterns that are burning kerosene or some similar oil, and where all significant distances were covered by railroads in this part of Iowa. But in the 1880s, things were much slower than they are today. Myron Edward Billings is a really interesting character. And I think character is probably a good term there. In the late 1860s, apparently comes to Waverly, and here he establishes a law practice. I would describe him as someone who was a bit of an iconoclast. In the 1880s, he publishes a book entitled The Crime of Preachers. Now, The Crime of Preachers is essentially a compilation of stories of criminal activities by people in the ministry. And that suggests that he probably didn't fit in some circles. We know that he is involved in a number of court cases. The most interesting one that I know of has him suing for defamation of character a couple named Francis and Cordelia LaRue. In that case, he represented himself. In this, the LaRues come out pretty well. The Waverly Democrat at the time pointed out that either they had not damaged his character very much, or he didn't have a very valuable character to damage. There are just a number of things that suggest that Billings may not have been all that well liked.
After settling in Waverly, Billings and his marriage began to struggle. Billings became fond of a young woman named Delia Welcher, and his wife grew suspicious. His wife filed for divorce, and Billings replied with a marriage certificate with his newfound lover.
She's in her mid-teens. He's in his mid-30s at the time.
Although the two were years apart, their love continuously grew. Billings soon befriended a young, ambitious lawyer, Willis S. Kingsley.
They had shared an office and were collegial. There's at least something that suggests that Kingsley looked at Billings a bit as a mentor. Billings is considerably older than Kingsley, and Kingsley is a very fresh lawyer. But that relationship begins to sour in the summer of 1887. Kingsley purchased the house that Myron and Delia were living in. And so there is this time between about May the 1st and mid-August sometime when the three of them are living under one roof. And that perhaps is one of the problems that would ultimately develop. He noticed that Kingsley and his wife really seemed to enjoy each other's company. They seemed to spend a great deal of time together, and he began to get a bit suspicious.
Billings's undying love for Delia was threatened as he witnessed Kingsley seducing and indulging in sexual relations with his wife. Billings knows of 4 sexual encounters, but there may have been more.
One of those 4 took place on August the 6th, when Kingsley and Delia were out for a ride in a carriage. Kingsley stops the carriage and says to Delia, "Now would be a good time for a little refreshment." they had intercourse there. A fairly daring move, I would think, since this was presumably a fairly public place. I found it interesting in the language that they used to refer to it. Delia confesses to having relations with Kingsley on a number of occasions. And there comes a point where it appears that Delia might be pregnant with Kingsley's child. Billings moves out of the office that he shared with Kingsley, and neither of them particularly wants to be around the other. One of the things that Billings does in preparation for confronting Kingsley is to create a number of documents that will serve as some sort of evidence for him, or try to extort money and property from him. One of which was purportedly a confession by Delia of her relationship with Kingsley. It's a document that Billings created, intentionally trying to lure Kingsley into some sort of a confession. It is signed D, presumably Delia. It's one of the things that Billings is going to use in his confrontation with Kingsley. It's December the 21st of 1887, and so it is just about the darkest day of the year. Witnesses describe Billings that afternoon as being very interested in what was happening up in Kingsley's office. There are 3 windows in Kingsley's office that overlook Bremer Avenue, and so Billings is able to see whether or not there's anyone in the office with Kingsley or not. Billings enters Kingsley's office. Kingsley's response is to tell him to get out, that he has no business there, he doesn't want him in the room. Billings insists that he has something to say. Billings notes that Kingsley could go to jail, could lose his reputation and his practice and his position as county attorney for the crime of seducing another's wife. Kingsley becomes subdued and is trembling and looks fearful. Billings says that he reaches for his overcoat and is turning to leave when he hears the click of a pistol, and he tries to run. He's 2/3 perhaps the way down when he feels something impact the center of his back. Shot. Shot. Thud. Apparently the body of Kingsley hitting the floor. Billings gets out onto the sidewalk. There are people there. He says that he's been shot, that Kingsley has shot him, and that he has papers in his coat that will prove why. In the meantime, people go up to Kingsley's office. There have been 2 shots and a thud. And they go up to Kingsley's office, and there he is on the floor, bleeding from a wound from the corner of his eye. The wound looks fatal. The gun is found on the floor of Kingsley's office, but it had been obscured from initial view by his leg. And so people initially looking at him didn't see a gun there. They call for a doctor, and in the meantime, Billings is taken to the nearby office of Dr. Oscar Burbank. There is a bullet lodged in his suspender brace that had been right in the middle of his back, and a wound that indicates something had impacted.
While Billings is being treated for his wound, Sheriff Jarvis arrived at the scene. Witnesses of Kingsley's body voiced their theory of Billings being the murderer of the young lawyer. Billings was then arrested on the scene. He was held in the county jail until taken to court for the death of Kingsley on April 3, 1888. Billings represented himself while E.A. Dawson represented Kingsley. Every seat and standing room was occupied by 300 to 400 men and only a handful of women. Delia sat by Billings' side through the trial, bearing the scrutiny of several masculine eyes. The jury came to a verdict, and Billings was convicted, guilty of murder in the second degree, and given a life sentence to the Anamosa Penitentiary. Due to the biased nature of the jury in Bremer County, Billings demanded a new trial. His wish was granted, and a new trial was secured at Black Hawk County. Billings had high hopes of an unbiased trial and being a free man.
At the outcome of that trial, the jury convicts Billings again of second-degree murder. The judge, in announcing the verdict, says that he's not quite sure how the jury arrived at that conclusion because the circumstances of the wound clearly suggest that it was suicide, that Kingsley had fired the fatal shot. And yet people still wanted to believe that somehow Billings had arranged all of this.
Billings, unsatisfied with the decision of the two lower courts, petitioned for the Iowa Supreme Court to hear his case. The state of Iowa versus Myron Edward Billings would be appealed by the Supreme Court. After reviewing Billings's previous trials, the Supreme Court found that the testimony to the killing is entirely circumstantial. The Supreme Court believes that the evidence provides clear indications of suicide. The guilt of the defendant is not shown to be of murderous character, and can certainly not override the affirmative facts that point to his innocence of the crime charged.
The court also held that the state had not positively proved that Billings had fired the shot, and that it was incumbent upon the state to have done so. When the evidence looked like Kingsley had committed suicide, and the state couldn't provide any more evidence that it was anything other than that, the verdict was overturned and Billings was freed. Kingsley is, at 25 years old, the county attorney. He is at the start of a professional career, and he already holds a position of responsibility. I don't think anyone wanted to believe that Kingsley could have done this, but it is clear that the affair is the point that breaks a relationship between Billings and Kingsley. As the Supreme Court puts it, he may have been a bad man, but that didn't make him guilty.